So it is good to be here, and I appreciate having the opportunity to talk about this subject. And as I begin, I want to give a little history, actually, about how this lecture came about, and it started. Let's see. So it started several months ago when Jamie, my good friend Jamie, called me and said that he and Stan had been talking, and that they would like for me to give a technology-based lecture at COS because of my background and experience. And he said, what I'd really like for you to talk about is ICD-10. It's the hot topic. Everybody wants to hear about ICD-10. And I said, Jamie, nobody wants to hear about ICD-10. I said, that is the most boring topic on earth. They would be comatose in 10 minutes if I talked about ICD-10. I just can't do that. And he said, no, really, that's really hot right now. That's what people want to talk about. I said, well, Jamie, it's kind of like this. The World Series, 2011. My Texas Rangers, who've never won the World Series before, are in the World Series. And it's game 6, and they're up 3-2. And it's the 9th inning, and they're holding on to this 1-run lead. And there's 2 outs and 2 strikes. And if you know anything about baseball, you know that we are 1 strike away from winning the World Series. This is Nelson Cruz misplaying the fly ball in right field, but had he caught it, we would have won the World Series. But he didn't. And so a run scored, and the game was tied, and this is what happened 2 innings later. And then, of course, the next day, the Cardinals won Game 7. So I said, Jamie, it's kind of like this. Here, you've had this wonderful conference. Every lecture has just been great all the way through. And this is the 9th inning. And you don't want me to come up here and talk about ICD-10. I don't want to be Nelson Cruz. Okay? So he said, no, really? That's what they want to hear. And so very, very reluctantly, I said, okay, Jamie, if that's what COS wants, I will do this. But just to show you how much God loves COS, 2 days later, our dear friend, Kathleen Sebelius, did what she had promised she would never do, and she postponed ICD-10 for another year. And now nobody, even Jamie, cared about ICD-10 anymore. So you are off the hook. We don't have to talk about that. And let me talk about something Let me talk about something perhaps a little more interesting. And here's what I need to tell you, if you don't know, that I do have a little bit of a financial disclosure here. I'm the founder of an EMR company for ophthalmology. Started this company about 5.5 years ago, and I now spend about half of my time working with that company. And so I'm still a clinician, but I spend a lot of my time in the health information technology world. And that's really the reason Jamie and Stan wanted me to give this talk. Now, you might think that I'm going to be a little bit biased here. And you would be exactly correct. Because I cannot help but be biased. I'm incredibly opinionated about all of these issues. And I just tell you that up front. I am. That's why I do what I do. I have strong opinions and strong feelings. But my hope and my prayer really is this, that this will be an opportunity for me to use my experience and my background to help you all understand some things that may be helpful to you. That's really my prayer, okay? So what I thought I might do is to talk about not just where we've been for the past 5 years, but really why we've gone from where we started 5 years ago. And when I speak we, the health information technology world that we all live in as physicians, what's happened over the last 5 years and why, and then a little bit about where we are now, and then also maybe a glimpse into where we're going in the next 5 years. So that's really kind of what I'd like to do. Now, one thing that's really kind of confusing, and something I'd like to clear up, is that many people, it's amazing when I go around and talk to people, how many people think that all of this stuff about meaningful use and PQRS and EMRs being kind of crammed down your throat all comes because of Obamacare. Well, that's not true at all. It has nothing to do with Obamacare. All of that was started before Obamacare was enacted into law. It actually goes back to the State of the Union Address 2004, and George W. Bush first began to talk about using government resources to promote EMRs because there was a thought that would help reduce the cost of healthcare. But nothing really happened until 2009, and this is the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, better known as the stimulus package, that newly elected President Obama signed into law. Part of that stimulus package was what's called the HITECH Act, and the HITECH Act is where all the legislation about meaningful use and all of these things come from. Okay, so that's really the background. So if you want to know, this is just an aside, if you want to know what it looks like to spend $861 billion of someone else's money, that's how you do it right there. So the HITECH Act, if you boil it down, the purpose of this act was to do two things. The purpose was to reduce the cost of healthcare and to improve the quality of healthcare. Laudable goals, no one could really argue that. Well, why on earth would we want to reduce the cost of healthcare? A couple of graphs might be helpful to understand that. This is looking back over the last 50 years, the percentage of our gross domestic product that has been spent on healthcare. And if you look back 50 years ago, about 5% of America's GDP was spent on healthcare. And that has obviously very steadily increased, so that in 2009, when the law was passed, it was close to 18%. And it was pretty obvious to everyone that this is a trend we can't continue this for much longer. But here's another more interesting graphic. This is a graph that looks at different countries and healthcare spending. And the horizontal axis is the amount of dollars per person per year that's spent on healthcare. And if you'll notice that the U.S. is way over here by ourselves to the right. So that we're spending way more than any of these other countries per person per year on healthcare. Okay, the vertical axis is life expectancy. Now you might think that countries that spend more on healthcare could expect a longer life expectancy for their population. But that's obviously not true. We're way over here to the right in spending, and yet we're kind of in the middle in terms of life expectancy. But another more interesting thing I think about this graph is that the size of these circles represent the number of outpatient clinic visits to the doctor that people in that country will have. And so what you see is that Japan, the average person in Japan has 3 times as many visits to the doctor as an American does, at 1/3 the cost. So graphs like this, I think, are the reason that people became really concerned about what's going on in our country in terms of the cost of healthcare, and that was the stimulus for all of these changes. So how in the world are we going to reduce the cost of healthcare? Well, we could reimburse you guys less. And I think we all expect that that's going to happen. Interestingly, it really hasn't happened that much. We've maintained fairly steady income levels, at least with regard to the amount of reimbursement, but we can expect that that's probably going to happen as time goes by. Well, the second thing we could do would be to eliminate waste. Everybody always talks about eliminating waste. Anytime you want to be more efficient and reduce costs, well, how could we do that? Well, we could reduce unnecessary testing. We all know that defensive medicine happens in this country. It's because of the litigation environment that we live in, and people order tests that they probably don't really need to do, but they're done because, well, we just need to be sure, because we don't want to be in any kind of medical legal risk. So that would involve tort reform. Or, of course, we could eliminate waste by reducing redundant testing, tests that get done over and over and over again because this doctor didn't have access to the test that doctor did. So either of those would work. Well, what about tort reform? Well, I'm going to step over into my just opinion circle and just say, I think as long as we have lawyers making laws, meaningful tort reform is probably not going to happen anytime soon. And it hasn't thus far. So we can put a big X by that, at least for now. That hasn't happened. What about this notion of redundant testing? Can we eliminate waste in that way? Well, there are a couple of ways that they talked about that could be done. Well, one thing that could have been done was to create a universal electronic medical record system. Envision this. If every clinic and every hospital and every doctor across the country were all part of one united, seamless, single electronic medical record system, wouldn't that be efficient? Wouldn't that be wonderful? All of that data would just pass back and forth, and oh my goodness, can you imagine? Can you imagine our federal government building an EMR that you would be happy with? Okay? Think about the website. A website is a very simple thing compared to an EMR. So fortunately, that didn't happen. But what did happen is that the government decided that what we want to do with this legislation is to create EMR systems and other health technology systems that would be interoperable, that they would pass information back and forth freely, and that all of the systems that can survive and do well in the free market environment can talk to each other. And so the thought was, if the government can be used to stimulate that interoperability, that would make sense, because these companies on their own really don't have the incentive. One company doesn't have the incentive to talk to another company. So that's a role for the government to incentivize that. And that was really the thinking. So how do we improve then the quality of healthcare? We've talked about cost. What about quality? Well, obviously we could improve technology, but really we did pretty well there. I mean, we just heard a lecture on femtosecond laser. We have the best technology anywhere in the world. And we have a system that already promotes that. We have a free market system and companies that make a profit by creating great technology and selling it. And as long as that exists, that's going to continue. So the people that making these decisions elected not to spend money in this HITECH Act on doing anything to improve technology. That really wasn't necessary. What they did decide was that they could tie reimbursements to quality. In other words, if I'm Medicare and I'm going to pay you, doctor, I want to be sure that you're practicing good quality medicine. And so that's where this whole PQRS and CQM system came from, and that's why they're there. Now again, I'm going to step over into my opinion circle and tell you that I'm not at all sure this is effective. I think it's probably completely useless in terms of actual quality. You can't even imagine. Well, I think you all know, those of you that deal with it, the amount of hassle and the amount of just disturbance in your practice this creates. You can't imagine what it's like for an EMR company if you've never been there. The hundreds of thousands of dollars that have to be spent to try to create the functionality to do these things. I mean, it's incredible. The millions of dollars this company has spent on, or this country has spent on these systems that, at least as best as I can tell, for ophthalmology. I can't speak for any other specialty. But in our specialty, I'm not at all convinced it really helps us in any way improve the quality of the care that we deliver. So unfortunately, that's the world that we live in, and if we want to be reimbursed the maximum amounts, then we have to play by the rules. The other way that we can improve the quality of care we deliver is to communicate better. And that's one thing that this, I think, does facilitate, again, through interoperability. If different systems talk to each other, doctors in different clinics in different places can communicate more effectively, and that's going to help us deliver better quality health care. So why is this whole interoperability business a big deal? Let me see if I can illustrate with an example that might ring true for you. Let's take a 56-year-old woman who has acute vision loss. That's her presenting complaint. So she goes to her optometrist, her regular optometrist, who does a complete history and exam, does a refraction, does visual fields, does disc photos because, I think that optic nerve is a little swollen. The optometrist says, I'm really not sure what's going on. I'm afraid you might have a brain tumor. So I'm going to send you to the ophthalmologist across town. So the patient goes to see the ophthalmologist. The ophthalmologist has maybe a brief note from the optometrist and repeats the history and exam, does another refraction, looks at this and thinks this looks like ischemic optic neuropathy. I'm concerned about giant cell arteritis, does all of the appropriate lab. But at this point, this ophthalmologist is saying, you know, this is really not my thing. I didn't go to Mike Lee's lecture, so I'm going to send you to the neuro-ophthalmologist for another opinion. So the patient goes to see the neuro-ophthalmologist. And of course, the neuro-ophthalmologist might have gotten a phone call from the ophthalmologist, but doesn't have those records, and certainly doesn't have the records from the optometrist who saw the patient in the beginning. So now the neuro-ophthalmologist is going to do a complete history and exam, and another refraction, and another visual field, and some more disc photos, and the neuro-ophthalmologist now says, you know what, this isn't GCA. You have classic disc at risk phenomenon, your lab is normal, you don't really have any other risk factors. This is non-arteritic anterior ischemic optic neuropathy. The neuro-ophthalmologist makes the correct diagnosis, as we always do, and sets the patient's mind at ease and says, you know, really at this point no further workup is needed, tells them the proper course of action, and the patient leaves. A week later, the patient is seen by the primary care physician for just a kind of a general checkup, and the primary care physician says, so what's been going on with you? Well, I had this loss of vision. Well, what did your eye doctor say? Well, I said, well, one doctor told me that I might have a brain tumor, another one told me that I might have this thing called giant something or other arthritis. And so the primary doctor says, well, of course, the primary care doctor doesn't have access to the records from the neuro-ophthalmologist or the other doctor, so the doctor says, well, let's just check that lab again, just to be sure that that's still normal. And he said, you might have a brain tumor? They didn't do an MRI? Well, let's get an MRI. And so now you've got an MRI scan, and so here's what's happened in this scenario, which all of you know happens all the time. This is not unusual. This is American medicine. So this person who had one fairly simple problem had 3 refractions, 2 sets of labs, 2 visual fields, 2 sets of disc photos, and an MRI scan that was completely unnecessary. And why did all of that happen? It all happened because those doctors couldn't communicate effectively. They didn't have the ability. I guess they could have picked up a phone, they could have, spent the time faxing and all those things that we can do but none of us have time to do. And because their systems were not interoperable, this is what happened. So this is what people who study this think, if we had those kind of interoperable systems, we could really save money and actually deliver more, not only cost-effective, but perhaps better quality care for our patients. So that's the concept of interoperability, and here's how it's done. It's all about codes or code sets. So you can think of it like this. If every computer, healthcare, HIT system spoke the same language, well, then they could all communicate. Well, those same languages, think of it in terms of code sets. Unfortunately, there's not one language or one code set. There are many. We're all familiar with ICD code. So this would be an easy thing, I think, for you to grasp if you're struggling with this concept. So I could take the ICD-9 code for pseudoexfoliation glaucoma. And I could send that code, whatever that is, some of you probably know what it is, you can send that number to any EMR system anywhere, and they could plug it into their system and know exactly what that means. It's a code that means something. Well, the same is true for CPT codes. That's a procedure code, and you can send that code anywhere. Well, the same is actually true for diagnostic devices. Now, those are DICOM codes that can be interpreted by different systems. The same is true for laboratory codes, but those are LOINC codes. There are RX norm codes for medications, and pretty much everything else can be dealt with SNOMED CT. It's a completely different set it's another code set. SNOMED CT actually allows you to do symptoms and signs and family relationships and pretty much any other term or concept, deals really with concepts, that you can come up with in medicine can be codified in SNOMED. And those codes can be put into some kind of package and sent and interpreted. So that's how interoperability at its core is actually done. All right, so where are we? Now, I told you I wasn't going to talk about ICD-10, but I'm going to give you a little, just one little brief blurb since we're talking about codes. So this is actually an ophthalmology practice manager who has been very concerned about what ICD-10 would bring to his practice, because he heard, like all of you probably have heard, that there's 7 times as many codes in ICD-10 as there are in ICD-9. So this is the super bill that he created for his doctors so that they would have a way to mark the code when they saw the patient. Well, obviously that's not terribly practical. So I'll give you another kind of insider secret. In the EMR world, it has been kind of common practice for EMRs to use the looming ICD-10 as a means of pushing customers to take the leap to EMR, because the concept is, you know, you can't do it on paper anymore. You're going to have an EMR if you want to be able to do ICD-10. Well, I will confess to you, that's probably not really true. There are 7 times as many codes, and you would have to do something different than you do now. But if you were determined to stay on paper, it can be done. You could have your kind of normal set of codes, very much similar to what you have now, and you circle your code, and then you have another section where you circle your laterality, right eye, left eye, both upper lids, or whatever that would be. And maybe then there would be a section for severity, and you could mark, instead of marking one thing, you might be marking 2 or maybe 3 things for each diagnosis. And then someone in your office could take that and plug that into some kind of system that would then help them come up with an ICD-10 code. So it would take a few extra minutes per patient, but you certainly could do it. Now, I'm not supposed to tell you that, but that's really the truth for ICD-10. Okay. So where are we now with interoperability in these systems? What can you expect from your EMR right now? Well, a brief blurb about eFax. eFax is something that's available, and it's efficient. You can send information, but really all you can send with an eFax, which is HIPAA compliant. Be sure you understand that you can't send email information with patient stuff, okay, because that's not HIPAA compliant. But you can send an eFax, and eFax is immediate, but the problem with eFax is that it's just text. And what you really want, probably if you're using an EMR, you want discrete data that you can pull in and plug into your system and do something meaningful with that. Now, a text is like an eFax of a letter or clinic note is certainly better than nothing, but it's not really what we need. So, what has been developed is something called the CCDA. Now, CCDA, if you are using right now any kind of electronic medical record and it's certified, then it has the ability right now to do this. Probably very few of you even know about it or have used it. It's not in use very much, but here's what it is. A CCDA is like a package. Think of it more like an email. And it's a package of information that has all of these codes, and you can have your problem list, your medications, your allergies, and procedures, and actually multiple other things, all put into codes, and you can send that packet of information with a click to whatever other doctor uses some kind of a certified EMR. He can accept that, import it into his record, and then his EMR automatically then populates all of those fields properly in that EMR. So two interoperable EMR systems can send that, what's called a CCDA. So that's actually already available, and I think you're probably going to be hearing more about it. It's just not being used very much yet because, again, few people know about it. But there is a problem. There are limitations with CCDA. The CCDA is not a good solution for what I call sequential events. In other words, when I'm seeing a patient, I don't want to know just a snapshot. And that's really what a CCDA is. It's at this point in time, here's kind of a list of all of the different things going on with this patient. What it doesn't tell you is what happened sequentially over the last couple of months. When I'm seeing a patient, I want to know what doctor they saw first and what was going on then and what happened next and what happened next. CCDA isn't going to help you with that. Also, exam findings. When I see someone, I want to know, what did that optic disc look like 2 weeks ago when that other doctor saw them? And the CCDA doesn't tell us that, anything about exam data. It doesn't really help us at all with diagnostic testing. That's one of the cornerstones of what we do, our OCTs and visual fields and those things. And it doesn't really help us with that. And it also doesn't really help us with thought processes. In other words, when I see someone I want to know what the last doctor did and why he did it. What was he thinking? Those thought processes don't come across in this way. So a CCDA is helpful, is certainly better than nothing, but my point is we've got a long way to go to really have the kind of interoperability that we're looking for. All right. So as far as quality, those are cost-related things. Where are we now in quality? Patient portals, I don't know if this has really touched you yet where you are, but I've been stunned, actually, to see how patients have actually really jumped on and adopted this notion of patient portals. It's becoming really big, and if you're not ready for it, you just better get there. Because patients like the idea, even older patients, the ones that we deal with, they like the idea of being able to go and sit down at their computer at home in their pajamas and click and see what their doctor said or what their lab was. Or unfortunately, I think I want to send an email to my doctor. I got a question. Well, you can do that with patient portals. And patients are beginning to expect that. That's the world that we live in now, and it's going to be more and more. Like it or not, that's kind of where we're headed. There are some good things about patient portals with regard to patient quality. There are some patient safety things that we could go into. But what I want to talk about is what we call higher order functionality. Now, I want you to kind of bear with me for just a second to help you understand a concept about EMR. I remember when I started in this business, I would have people come to me saying, you know what, I appreciate what you're doing with EMR, but I really like my piece of paper. You know, what I'd like you to do with EMR, I've spent years designing my form so that when I go in and see a patient, I can just go tick, 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 tick on this piece of paper and document my exam, and I'm done. It just takes me seconds. What I want you to do with your EMR is to make it just like my piece of paper. Okay? That's what we call first order functionality or first order thinking. Making an EMR just record data just like you would on a piece of paper. And if that's all you want an EMR to do, if you wanted to stay first order, then stay with paper. Because an EMR is not going to help you really much at all if it's just first order. Now, second order functionality is this. Second order means that an EMR can take that information that's been put in and it can reorganize it and present it back to the user in a way that makes sense, makes it more efficient. Summary screens, or taking images and pulling all your OCTs together and showing them to you all at once, or whatever it is. An EMR is really, really good at taking that information and presenting it back to a doctor in a way that can make you more efficient. You can see on one little grid all of your previous exams and click on the one you want to look at. It really beats flipping through a chart and trying to process things. So that's what we call second order functionality. And most EMRs do some of that and some of that pretty well. But then there's something called third order functionality. And third order means this. An EMR, if intelligently programmed, can take the data that you put in, assimilate it and process it, and come out with a result that you could not have derived yourself. Something that you couldn't have come up with your own mental capacities that you couldn't have done on paper. Now that's third order functionality, and if that's kind of a new concept for you, it's something that is new to EMR and doesn't really exist yet, with one exception. And I'll go to that in just a minute. But here's kind of an illustration of the way I look at these. This, of course, is first order functionality. It's like that old rotary telephone. For those of my residents sitting back there, this is how we used to make phone calls, okay? But you've never seen one. Second order functionality would be like this nice, cool digital answering machine. That was a huge upgrade from the old rotary phone, because now you've got an answering machine that can remember messages and give you recordings and it does a lot of things that speed dial. So if you can think back 20 years to when this was kind of the state-of-the-art technology, that was pretty cool. And if you can think back that far, those of you that are old enough to do that, you can remember that you couldn't even imagine an iPhone. 20, 30 years ago, no one could even imagine communication with an iPhone and what that might mean for your life, the good things and the bad things, but we had no concept. But in the EMR world, that's kind of what I think is coming, is there's going to be this third order functionality that will be for EMR like an iPhone. In other words, where we are right now is here, but I think this is the future. And here's an example, and it may take just a couple of minutes to kind of explain this. And it has to do with coding. Coding is a very, very complicated thing. Those of you that see patients and build codes, you know and understand this. And I'm going to specifically speak about the established patient and E&M codes. And I know there's I codes and S codes and all sorts of other things, but let's just talk for illustration purposes about that typical established patient. So if you look at your coding history over the course of a year, each of us have our own kind of distribution of frequency of codes. And so for this particular example, this person builds, a couple of level 2s and mostly level 3s and 4s and almost no level 5s. So this would be that particular doctor's bell curve of coding distribution, and that's what that doctor has been doing for years. And all of you who've been coding do that. Now, I know that everyone in this room always codes 100% correctly every single time. I know that you do. But the national average, if you talk to coding experts, what they will tell you is that ophthalmologists get it right about 70% of the time. Which means that 30% of the time, even when you've been to that coding course and you're really trying hard and you're doing your very level best to code properly, if you're like the national average, 30% of the time you're getting it wrong. Now, if you're getting it wrong 30% of the time, how much of the time do you think you're actually over-coding, and how much of the time do you think you're actually under-coding? It's almost all under-coding. That's what we do. When we miscode, we systematically undercode. Why do we do that? We do it because, number one, we're scared. We're scared of overcoding inadvertently. We don't want to commit fraud. And secondly, because the system is so incredibly complicated, nobody can actually do it. If you think you can actually code according to the rules as written every single time correctly, you're really kidding yourself. None of us can do that. Our brains cannot process that much data that quickly. Even the coding experts can't do that right every single time. So what do we do? When we code, if you're really honest about how when you get to the end of an encounter and you write down, this is going to be a level 3 or a level 4, or whatever it is you're coding, what you're doing is you're kind of guessing. Now, you know that it's kind of patterns. You've been to your courses, you've studied the rules, you kind of have the concepts, and you know that this patient or this encounter that kind of looks like this looks like a level 3. And this encounter, whatever your little process is in your head, this looks like a level 4, a level 2, whatever it is. And so you just kind of fit patterns. And you get it right about 70% of the time. Okay. So if you had an EMR system that had all of that data built in and was able to process 200 plus pieces of information in microseconds, and pull it in and process based on all of those algorithms and do all of that complex math and everything and do it accurately, you then have something that would give you something probably more like this. If you coded based on what a really good quality coding engine told you, your curve would be different. You would probably have fewer level 3s and more level 4s and more level 5s. Because then you would be coding according to the rules as written. All right? Now, if you put that in linear form, it would look more like this. So this was your curve before, but now if you're coding according to the coding engine recommendations and actually coding exactly 100% correct every single time, you're going to be like this. Now, there's some implications about audit risk, and that's kind of a different discussion. And if you want to talk about that later, we can. But if that happened, you would say, wow, look at that. I'm doing the same work, and I'm making more money because I'm doing higher codes. Well, now think about this. What actually is happening across the country right now is that more and more people are using EMRs and more people are using these coding engines, And across the country, this curve is shifting to the right. So if this were the national curve is becoming this. So our healthcare system, now that's set out to try to help us, encourage us to use EMR systems so that we can save money, is now paying out more because we're billing more. Well, is that going to continue? Well, probably not. What's probably going to happen, and in fact is already happening, is that the reimbursements for these codes is going to come down so that your net reimbursement at best is going to stay the same if you adopt this new curve. The implication then also is that if you're still on this curve, you're going to be reimbursed less. So my point in all of this is just to help to illustrate something that an EMR can do that your brain can't do. An EMR can process this information in a way that's what computers are really, really good at. So that's an example of what we call third order functionality. Now, where are we going with all of this? What does the future hold? I like this photograph because it says a number of different things. I think some of you, I know some of you in this room, think that you're on this train and that the train is going this way, into the darkness of the black cave, right? And maybe you're right, and your perception is that, and for you, well, that's your reality. I tend to think that I'm on this train and it's going that way. And I can't necessarily see around that curve, but I see that there's light out there. And it's kind of foggy, but there's light. And I think there's really exciting future in health information technology. I really believe that. And one thing that I think is going to happen is that innovation in the future is going to be more around health information technology as opposed to hardware. In the future, we're going to see more and more innovation around information technology. Secondly, I think what we're going to see is more seamless interoperability. I talked about the problems with what we have now, the limitations of this CCDA. We're going to solve that. And in time, we're going to have interoperable systems that allow us to feed information and data back and forth between systems, not just across town, but across cultures and countries. Because those codes are not even tied to a given language. If you take a patient's record and you codify it, you can send that to France or to Germany or to Korea or wherever and have it translated into that language. It doesn't matter anymore. It's just codes. So that's the future, I think, of interoperability. The third thing is that I think what we're going to see is clinical research is going to be revolutionized. What do I mean by that? It has to do with big data, and particularly these web-based systems that accumulate large amounts of patient data. Right now, if you have a question that you want to study, hopefully you can come up with a process in clinical research to evaluate your question and come up with an answer, and hopefully that will be statistically significant when you're done. So how is that done right now in 2014? Well, right now, you would probably create a study, and a typical study might cost $1 million, and you would have a very nice, tightly controlled, prospective, randomized study, and you might recruit 100 patients to that study, and when you're done, you come up with an answer that is statistically significant, and you've been successful. But it took a lot of money, it took a lot of time. Because we're now going to have access to these databases with an enormous amount of data that can be actually fairly simply de-identified so that patient information is protected. What might this look like in the future? Well, I think for maybe a fraction of the cost, instead of studying 100 patients, you study 10,000 patients with the same question. Now, it's not going to be as tightly controlled and that nice prospective randomized study that we've been used to, but the N is so large that you'll still be able to come up with an answer and get a statistically significant answer with much less cost, much less time, and I just think that makes too much sense to not happen. I think that's going to be a lot of what happens in clinical research in the future. It's not going to be the answer to everything, but I think that is one place that this is going. The other thing we've already alluded to is this third order functionality. I can't even begin to tell you because I don't know. I've got a great imagination, but I can't necessarily think of all the things that can be done. What can you imagine? In other words, if you put yourself back with that answering machine 25 years ago, could you imagine an iPhone? Probably not. But there are things, for example, what is the differential diagnosis for this patient? That EMR knows an awful lot about your patient. And if programmed intelligently, maybe it would help you come up with those more obscure differentials. What IOL is best for, not for this eye, but for this patient? Does this glaucoma patient really need surgery? It knows everything about your patient. And it can know all of the studies and all of the outcome studies and things that are out there, and it can be evidence-based and give you good feedback in a fraction of a second. You've got a uveitis patient. What's the best workup for this particular uveitis patient? This has to do with outcomes. How much ESO does my 6 millimeter medial rectus recession really correct? In other words, I think I know what it is, but if I've got a system that can actually assess all of my outcomes and tell me exactly, my 6 millimeter recession really only gives me 70, 80% of what I thought. And then how do my results compare with my colleagues? Now you may say, well, there's a lot of information there that we don't want to know. Well, okay. And that's kind of the flip side to this. I'm just telling you, this is what's coming. This is the world that we live in. What I do think is that in the future, when someone asks, what's the most indispensable tool you have in your clinic? It won't be your OCT or your visual field. I think what you're going to say is, it's my EMR. I can't imagine how I would live without it. That may be biased, but I think that's where we're headed. All right. So I did write a couple of white papers that are on the COS website that if you're interested in reading those a little bit more details about these topics, or I'd be happy to talk with any of you later. So thank you very much. I appreciate your patience.